Welcome to Strategy Speaks, the official podcast of the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. Welcome back, and I'm your host, Daniel Fiott. I'm very happy to introduce this 24th episode of Strategy Speaks, where we'll be welcoming Antonio Missiroli for a discussion about not only the 2026 World Cup, but also some of its geopolitical implications and international relations implications. We will discuss with Antonio a number of questions related to the politics of the World Cup, and we'll be building upon a recent paper that he published, a commentary that he published with the Italian Institute for International Political Studies, focusing specifically on the politics of the World Cup, where he takes a historical and more contemporary look at what the World Cup means in terms of international relations. And I would encourage all of our listeners to go and find that paper. Antonio doesn't really need much of an introduction, but let me begin by introducing him as the Senior Advisor for Europe and Global Governance, Security and Defense at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. And of course, Antonio comes with a wealth of policy experience and political experience, having been the former Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO, and also prior to this, being the Director of the EU Institute for Security Studies, plus a whole host of different senior positions with various think tanks in Europe, and also in terms of teaching at multiple universities, where Antonio has been able to share his views on politics and international relations more broadly. A very warm welcome to you, Antonio, to this session of Strategy Speaks.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Great. Well, let's jump right in. I mean, we're in, at the moment, the thick of it, of the World Cup right now, and of football. And beyond, I guess, the excitement of whatever Lionel Messi is doing on the pitch and other players, and some of the surprise draws that we're seeing in terms of results and those teams that are progressing. And looking at the World Cup this year in particular, I wondered if I could get from you your initial reaction on what do you think the main geopolitical story of this World Cup is. I mean, in other words, what do you think historians will remember most about it? And maybe as, active or passive engagers with the World Cup, what should we really be paying attention to? What will be the defining geopolitics of this World Cup?
Even in this particular respect, every World Cup has a before, a during, and an after time. The before so far has been dominated, of course, by the main host country, the United States, the personality of Donald Trump, the tensions with Iran, the whole saga of the Iran team, the tense relations between the three host countries, Canada, United States, and Mexico, especially over the past year and a half, and of course the expectation that also domestic politics in the US might play a role. After all of the 11 cities in the US where matches are going to be played, all of them are run by Democrats. And therefore, domestic politics, especially in the run-up to the midterm elections, might play a role. And that was the before. When matches start, of course, the focus inevitably and understandably goes into the politics of each match, the kind of identity of supporters to some extent now, and I think even more so in the days and weeks to come, the presence of political leaders in the stadiums, the way in which they will want to be seen backing their own country, their own team, and especially if the team is going to, that will to some extent play a role. And of course, I think it is important to understand that when the after will come, there will be an assortment of winners and losers, surprises, the villains, those who have been disappointing, and so on and so forth. We already have a sort of regional balance sheet to this effect. I mean, one of the most striking features is the emergence of African teams in terms of quality of play, the way in which they stay on the pitch. Also, the little bit of lack of luck that they have had on a number of matches, especially when confronted with top European teams that were very often in the lead until the very end, and they collapsed in the dying minutes of each match. But still, in general terms, the World Cup, especially now the World Cup at 48 countries, which is basically 1/4 of the international community represented there, represent a sort of, I could have put it, alternative world of international relations. It is an alternative world in which Europe is still an important player as a collective actor, the sum of its components, but clearly a little bit on the decline. It is a world in which America has a center and a south that are stronger than the north. That is quite striking and surprising as compared to the rest of the world. It is a world in which Asia is not rising. It is a world in which Africa actually is rising quite spectacularly. And last but not least, it is a world in which China and Russia are completely absent.
Excellent way to kick us off. And yeah, and I'm reminded of these this kind of criticism that we hear if you're watching the World Cup games on the television. The American producers tend to pan towards these so-called celebrities, which us in Europe and probably elsewhere in the world have no clue who they are. But I think your point about the fact that more and more politicians will be attending these events, I think for viewers will have a very big impact in terms of how politics and money are combining within the World Cup. And I think you've already given us an indication, actually, of a very interesting indication, actually, of how this question of the World Cup fits also within growing powers, growing cultures, civilizations, however we want to put it. You particularly stressed the rise of Africa, which I certainly also see as well. But your final point was really interesting on the almost absence of Russia and China in all of this. So I guess my second question to you here is, what does the World Cup really tell us about these kind of shifting or changing world orders? I mean, you also said in your remarks that probably as Europeans, we've become used to dominating the sport, but that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. Europeans are maybe not as doing as well as they do or should do, which is a bit strange when you consider how well European leagues perform, domestic leagues perform in international relations. But we're also seeing maybe the rise of a multipolar World Cup, geopolitical world through the World Cup. Is that something also that you see?
Well, of course, if you look back at the history of the game, it started in Europe, and Europe was the spreading agent of football, in particular the British Empire, both the formal and the informal empire, including South America, was the most important vector for spreading the game. Also socially, it moved from a sort of elite game in colleges and universities in England to the working class worldwide, especially in Europe, mining center, ports, industrial cities, and so on and so forth. It took roots in the Austro-Hungarian Empire between the two worlds. The countries that were the heirs to the Austro-Hungarian Empire were world powers in football. And for a long time, it became a sort of bipolar world, the two poles being Europe in general and South America. For many, many decades, the World Cup was hosted alternatively in Europe and Latin America. It was only in the 1970s and beyond, in part also as the result of a policy that was carried out consciously by FIFA, by Joao Avelange first and Joseph Blatter afterwards. There was a sort of multipolarization of the game. There were even forms of development aid by FIFA to African and Asian federations in order to become more important actors. There was a conscious investment in the United States already with the World Cup in 1994, and of course, even more so now in the 21st century. The European lead, to some extent, started waning in the 1990s. It is even arguable that there was a short 20th century of European football that came to an end in the 1990s with the globalization of the game, mainly carried out through TV. And the commercialization of the game. At the same time, of course, the globalization was accompanied by a sort of recentering of football in Europe. The fact that the Premier League and the Champions League started more or less at the same time in 1992, and they attracted football talent from all over the world. Some people talk about the food drain with reference to the brain drain that happened between the center and the periphery of the world economy throughout the ages. That makes sense to some extent. And that also meant a sort of shift in football power from national teams to clubs. The big clubs have emerged in Europe. There are a couple of attracting talent from all over the world. They become the main actor, and to some extent even FIFA is starting acknowledging them. Last year there was the first edition of the World Cup for clubs and not just for nations. But at the same time there still remains a sort of allegiance to a national team that plays an important role in that respect. So there has been globalization at the same time, multipolarization, but also a sort of re-Europeanization, because Europe has become the center, in particular for club games. Interestingly, the talent that grows and develops inside European clubs then spreads back into the national team, to the extent that most of the African players that we have admired so far in this edition of the World Cup play for European clubs. The passport that is most common among players at the World Cup is a French passport, but it's not simply the French. And even the French team, which is one of the most brilliant ones at the World Cup, has a very high number of players with double passports. So that indicates something that is happening ever more so. The Moroccan team that defeated the Netherlands had half of the team with a Dutch passport. So that is one of the most intriguing developments, the sort of multi-belonging of key players and team players that to some extent blurs now the distinction between national teams, but also the distinction between national teams and clubs.
Yeah, fascinating stuff, and fully follow the logic that you painted there for us in terms of maybe the waning of European success or presence in terms of national teams, but having this kind of like underlying soft power almost in the success of others. And the only thing I would add actually to your excellent analysis would also be how the Europeans tend to also export managers and coaches to different parts of the world, right? Which is interesting because it's also, again, maybe another form of soft power in terms of the tactics that teams, develop, even though they have their own unique physical styles as well and skill sets. It's also interesting to point out, and I saw this the other day on a map that somebody showed it to me, that pretty much all of the World Cup winners so far fall within the axis that you rightfully pointed to, which is Europe and South America, Latin America. So again, we'd probably have to wait a few more years or even decades to see how that changes. And we certainly don't know how this World Cup will end, of course. But it is, I think, very interesting, this relationship that you point to between club football, international football, and the enduring love as well of many people for their national teams, which I think is also very evident. So far, we've spoken, I think, about how maybe politics can be found in football in the World Cup. I mean, you rightfully pointed out in your opening remarks, the current kind of conflict or climate between the US and Iran and et cetera, et cetera. But I'm wondering if we can flip that logic on its head a bit, right? You've also written about this in respect to the Olympics as well, I think, in past writings of yours, where you've also spoken about how the sport itself can be used as a form of diplomacy. And we've seen, of course, individuals like Infantino very much ride this wave of seeing football as a kind of peacemaker, or at least potential peacemaker within the world. So how do you see not necessarily how football is being shaped by international politics, but is there some room for sports, especially the World Cup, to shape diplomacy and power in its own right?
Well, there have been cases in the past in which the World Cup and in general international football played a positive role. There have also been contested cases. I mean, of course, when the World Cup was hosted by fascist Italy in the 1930s, or Videla's Argentina in 1978, there was a lot of contestation. There were even attempts in 1978 to boycott participation in the World Cup. And more recently, when the World Cup was, the organization was given to Russia or Qatar, and next potentially also Saudi Arabia, there were a number of background noises about the opportunity or not to participate. Political leaders did not necessarily attend the matches. That was in particular the case with Russia in 2018, and so on and so forth. So there is always some room for controversy in there. I just think of the rivalry between England and Argentina, 1982, but also after that, the famous performance by Diego Maradona against England in 1986 was widely seen and perceived in Argentina as a sort of revanche for the Falklands Malvinas War, and so on and so forth. I mean, there have been historical rivalries between Argentina and Brazil, between other European teams and Germany. I mean, they also reflected to some extent mutual perceptions, popular beliefs, and so on and so forth. That is a fact. Football diplomacy has also played some role. Between, for instance, the two Germanys during the Cold War, there was a famous match, the World Cup in 1974, that actually East Germany won, and later on West Germany won the cup. There was a friendly in the qualification phase between the two Koreas in the late 1990s. There has been also outside the World Cup a famous case of football diplomacy between Armenia and Turkey just 20 years ago, when the two respective presidents visited the other hosting team on the occasion of matches. In the end, Turkey won the two matches and went on to the World Cup. But for a short period of time, there was a sort of good diplomacy between the two, and it was called back then football diplomacy. Even the organization of the World Cup sometimes is driven by an effort of goodwill between the co-organizers. The first case in point has been, of course, South Korea and Japan in 2002, that had tense relations between them. The second one was originally the one of the World Cup that is currently underway, when after the NAFTA trade deal, there was a push towards integrating more North and Central America, Mexico, United States, and Canada. It happens that now the situation is not at all like that. And of course, even in view of the next World Cup that will be hosted jointly by Spain, Portugal, and Morocco, one of the issues that to some extent facilitated in the end all this was the recognition by first Spain and then later on Portugal of Western Sahara as part of Morocco. It led to some political tensions inside Spain, but in the end now that is widely seen as something promising in view of the next World Cup. So at the same time, of course, the World Cup is influenced by international politics, bilateral rivalries, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it can also act as a promoter of goodwill between countries and between populations.
Yeah, thanks so much for that response. I think that was very, very interesting indeed, looking at it from the other side of football maybe influencing. And you pointed to a number of historical cases there, although in the case of Germany, it seems that you, even as the East, you can win a game of football but lose history, right? Which is how it goes. So there are many, many examples, I think, that you rightfully point to where the football world tries to have its influence. And I particularly found interesting what you said, even in terms of which country or countries are selected to host the World Cup, being an intensely political act in itself. So thanks for that. And I'm not going to let you go, by the way, Antonio, because I know that you're a massive football fan, but I can't help ask you about how you see the more football side of things in this World Cup, right? So I take it, just like myself and other viewers, you've been quite excited by some of the games. We're recording this, by the way, just after two African teams, DR Congo and Senegal, only slightly missed out on qualifying to the next round. But what have you made of the football so far at the World Cup? And do I dare push you on some finalists or potential winners?
Predictions are always very difficult, especially when they are about the future. That is a famous made, I think, by a famous physicist in the 20th century. What we have seen so far is that France has been by far the most brilliant team on the pitch. Argentina, at times Brazil, Morocco has shown good football. The story of the World Cup is full of cases in which teams that played very well at the beginning, to some extent, waned at a later stage, in part out of tiredness, or in part just because other teams that had struggled at the beginning found themselves during the tournament. This tournament is even longer than previous one because of the 48 teams participating. So that increases the difficulty of making prediction. But of course, I would say France is a hot favorite. They have an experienced coach. They have a team full of talent. And when you see them playing, you have the impression they enjoying playing together. That is an important factor. Whether this is going to last until the very end, it's a different story. The fact that now matches are in or out, and they very often end with the penalty shootout, increases the uncertainty of making predictions to this effect. There are dark horses that are quite visible. England, if it plays better than last night. Spain, of course, Argentina. Brazil, if they grow throughout the tournament. Morocco is also a potential contender. I mean, they have experience. They already arrived at the semi-finals last time round. They won the Africa Cup of Nations. They have many players who play in Europe, and so on and so forth. So that is the picture at this stage. It will be interesting to see how far the host teams will go. Normally, there is also a sort of inclination on the part of the organization to favor them going as far as possible. And the United States and Mexico have a chance in that respect more than Canada. And that is also when I think the potential politicization may reemerge more clearly. Difficult to predict in what direction and in what sense, but I suspect that when we get to the quarterfinals, the semifinals, and of course the final, political leaders will show up.
Yeah, brilliant way to end our discussion. I was going to say, it's very much like football itself. It's a game of two halves, as you were saying, the beginning and after stages. But of course, now with hydration breaks, we're also talking maybe about four quarters. So I'm not sure how that works out. But thanks so much for sharing your assessment, and also indeed for all of the other content and thoughts and ideas that you've shared with us. And before ending the session, I just do want to also invite again our listeners of Strategy Speaks to also look out on social media, not only for this episode, but also the link to Antonio's commentary piece for ISPI on the World Cup, where you will find a lot more detail and a lot more ideas from him. So thanks so much, Antonio, for joining me for this 24th episode.